Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the wonderfully unpredictable world of medieval pranks, where practical jokes had an unfortunate tendency to end with someone losing their dignity, their fortune, or occasionally their head. So before you get comfortable, take a moment like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Few places in medieval Europe were better suited for a practical joke than a noble banquet. The wine flowed generously, musicians filled the hall with lively tunes, servants hurried between endless courses, and by the time roasted boar had been followed by pies, cheese, and another round of wine that absolutely nobody needed but enthusiastically accepted anyway, even the most serious nights had relaxed. Which, as history repeatedly demonstrates, is exactly when someone decides to do something profoundly unwise. The Middle Ages had no social media, but they did have banquet halls. If you embarrassed yourself in front of 200 nobles, the news travelled across the kingdom before you had even reached home. Medieval gossip moved at the speed of a frightened horse. Imagine arriving at a neighbouring lord's castle after riding through rain, mud, and roads that generously alternated between barely passable and actively trying to kill you. You surrender your sword to the attendants, straighten your expensive cloak, and step into the magnificent Great Hall. Hundreds of candles illuminate colourful banners hanging from towering wooden beams. Long tables overflow with roasted venison, fresh bread, fragrant herbs, imported spices worth small fortunes, and enough ale to convince almost anyone that politics was a wonderful idea. Tonight is supposed to strengthen alliances. Naturally, someone has other plans. A handful of young squires, having reached that dangerous age where confidence vastly exceeds wisdom, decide the evening could use a little entertainment. Unfortunately, medieval entertainment often came at someone else's expense. While their chosen victim is distracted greeting fellow nobles, the squires quietly begin rearranging his place at the table. His beautifully engraved silver goblet disappears, replaced by an ordinary wooden cup, usually reserved for minor servants. His richly embroidered cushion is swapped with one so lumpy it feels as though someone stuffed it with walnuts and mild disappointment. His personal servant is secretly instructed to wait on another guest instead, leaving the unfortunate noble repeatedly reaching for dishes that never quite arrive. At first, he assumes it is an honest mistake. After the third course passes him by while everyone else happily eats, he begins to suspect the universe has developed a personal grudge. Around him, quiet chuckles begin spreading down the table. One knight suddenly finds his bread incredibly fascinating. Another develops a desperate interest in the ceiling beams. A lady nearly inhales her wine, trying not to laugh. Even the court musicians, whose job is to remain dignified while someone inevitably requests the same song for the 7th time, struggle to keep straight faces. Today, this might become a viral dinner video. Back then, it became a diplomatic incident. To modern eyes, changing someone's cup or seat seems harmless enough. In medieval society, however, seating arrangements were practically a language of their own. Every chair, every servant, every plate, every goblet announced exactly where you ranked in the complicated ladder of noble society. Sitting one place lower than expected wasn't just inconvenient, it suggested everyone present believed you deserved to be there. And nothing irritated a medieval noble more than discovering his social status had apparently been downgraded without prior consultation. Finally, the victim notices the mismatched goblet. Then, the missing servant. Then the laughter. He slowly stands. The hall becomes so quiet you could probably hear a fly reconsidering its career choices. His face reddens. not from the wine, although that certainly isn't helping, and he demands to know who orchestrated the insult. The host immediately insists it was nothing more than youthful foolishness. The squires, who only moments earlier had been congratulating themselves on comedic brilliance, suddenly become experts in studying the flaw. Curiously, nobody volunteers to explain the joke. Apologies follow almost immediately. Unfortunately, apologies and wounded pride have never enjoyed a particularly productive relationship. Within days, angry letters travel between the two noble households. Family members insist their honour has been deliberately attacked. Friends choose sides. Every retelling makes the prank more outrageous than the last. Before long, the silver goblet has become a golden chalice. The missing servant has become an organised conspiracy, and someone is confidently claiming the entire feast had been planned solely to humiliate one man. History occasionally resembles an exaggerated fishing story. Eventually, the dispute reaches the only conclusion medieval aristocrats seemed to consider truly mature: a formal duel. No one remembers the uncomfortable cushion. No one talks about the missing dinner. Everyone remembers the swords. It's a perfect example of medieval humour in a single story. The prank itself lasted perhaps 10 minutes. The argument lasted months. And the lesson was painfully simple. If you're going to embarrass someone in front of half the kingdom, make absolutely certain they have a better sense of humour than a medieval noble. Statistically speaking, they probably won't. If there was one group in medieval Europe that consistently proved intelligence and common sense were not always close friends, it was university students. Much like students today, they enjoyed debating philosophy, avoiding work whenever possible, surviving on questionable meals, and convincing themselves that every terrible idea was, in fact, hilarious. Unlike students today, however, many of them also carried knives. Medieval universities in cities like Paris, Oxford and Bologna were bustling places filled with thousands of young men who had travelled great distances to study theology, law, medicine, and the fine art of arguing about subjects no one outside the university particularly cared about. They lived in crowded lodgings, spent long evenings in taverns, and frequently found themselves at odds with local townspeople. The relationship between students and residents was strained. Imagine packing several hundred teenagers into one neighbourhood, giving them very little supervision, and reminding them that they were among the most educated people in Europe. Nothing could possibly go wrong. One favourite target for mischief was the town's church bells. In medieval cities, bells were far more than clocks. They announced fires, enemy attacks, important religious services, executions, royal visits, and other emergencies. When the great bell rang unexpectedly, people didn't casually glance out the window. They ran. Late one autumn night, after far too much ale and an evening spent trying to outdo one another with increasingly foolish ideas, a handful of students slipped into a church tower. Whether they simply wanted to frighten the town or genuinely wondered what would happen next remains unclear. Either way, someone pulled the rope. The enormous bell exploded across the sleeping city. Within moments, chaos erupted. Families stumbled from their homes half-dressed. Merchants rushed outside convinced their shops were burning. Soldiers grabbed weapons. Priests hurried toward the church expecting disaster. Mothers searched desperately for missing children, while neighbours shouted contradictory rumours across narrow streets. The castle is under attack. No, it's a fire. I heard the French are here. Considering this happened in France on more than one occasion, that particular rumour required a little refinement. Meanwhile, the students watched from the shadows, trying very hard not to laugh loudly enough to give themselves away. For a few glorious minutes, the prank appeared to be a complete success. Then the town discovered there was no fire, no invading army, no collapsing bridge, just hundreds of furious people standing in the middle of the street at 2 a.m. wondering who had interrupted perfectly good sleep. And medieval people valued sleep. After all, candles were expensive, beds were uncomfortable, and if you actually managed to fall asleep despite the snoring, livestock, fleas, and the occasional rooster with absolutely no respect for sunrise, you wanted to keep sleeping. The authorities immediately began searching for whoever had rung the bell. Finding the culprits wasn't especially difficult. University students had many talents. Remaining quiet after successfully pulling off a prank was rarely one of them. Several of the guilty young scholars proudly retold the story in taverns the very next evening, apparently forgetting that taverns were full of witnesses who enjoyed rewards almost as much as gossip. The university attempted to defend its students, arguing they were simply immature. The townspeople argued they were idiots. For perhaps the only time in medieval history, both sides may have been completely correct. The prank became another chapter in the long-running feud between town and gown, reminding everyone that a single pull of a bell rope could wake an entire city and leave the pranksters wishing they had simply gone to bed instead. If anyone in medieval Europe could get away with insulting a king to his face, it was the court jester. Usually. The position of royal fool was one of the strangest jobs ever invented. His duty was to entertain the court with jokes, songs, clever observations, and the occasional insult directed at the most powerful people in the kingdom. While everyone else carefully chose every word before speaking to the monarch, the fool was expected to say what others dared not. It was an extraordinary privilege. It was also a spectacularly dangerous misunderstanding if taken too literally. Many jesters were far more intelligent than people assumed. Behind the colourful clothes, jingling bells, and exaggerated behaviour often hid remarkably sharp minds. Kings valued them because humour had a curious way of revealing uncomfortable truths. A joke could criticise bad decisions without sounding like open rebellion. Most of the time, one famous tradition tells of a royal banquet where the king had spent the evening proudly boasting about a recent military victory. Every noble around the table enthusiastically agreed that the campaign had been brilliant. The generals praised his courage. The bishops thanked God for his wisdom. Even the servants nodded along while quietly hoping nobody asked their opinion. Then the fool stood up. He looked around the hall, bowed dramatically, and announced that he wished to congratulate His Majesty for achieving something no previous ruler had ever managed. The king smiled. The court leaned forward. The fool continued. "You have discovered a way to win a war while allowing everyone else to do the fighting." For one glorious second, absolute silence filled the hall. Then a few nervous chuckles escaped. One knight laughed a little too loudly before realizing everyone else had stopped. He immediately found tremendous interest in his roasted chicken. The king stared at the fool. Nobody moved. Even the dogs lying beneath the tables seemed to sense that this was not the ideal moment to bark. The joke itself was clever enough. Medieval rulers often stayed behind the front lines while their armies carried out campaigns. Everyone in the room understood the meaning immediately. That was precisely the problem. A successful joke usually contains a little truth. An unsuccessful joke contains a little too much. The fool quickly realized he had wandered beyond the invisible boundary separating amusing honesty from public embarrassment. Every noble present had just watched the king become the target of laughter in his own great hall. Royal pride was many things. Fragile was certainly one of them. Fortunately for the jester, this particular king possessed something surprisingly rare: patience. After what felt like an entire lifetime, the monarch slowly smiled. Then he laughed. The room erupted with relieved laughter so suddenly that several guests nearly spilled their wine. One elderly baron laughed so hard he reportedly began coughing into his beard, proving once again that survival occasionally depends on timing. The king eventually pointed toward the fool. "Careful," he reportedly said. "One day your tongue will outrun even your legs." The court laughed again. The warning, however, was perfectly genuine. Not every ruler reacted with such generosity. Medieval chronicles contain stories of fools who lost their positions, their freedom, or, according to later legends, even their lives after mocking the wrong prince, or exposing an especially embarrassing truth. Being a court jester was rather like walking across a frozen lake. As long as everyone kept laughing, the ice held. The moment it didn't, you discovered just how cold medieval justice could be. Monasteries were among the quietest places in medieval Europe. They were meant to be places of prayer, study, and peaceful reflection, where monks copied manuscripts, tended gardens, brewed ale, and occasionally spent an entire afternoon arguing over the correct way to pronounce a single Latin word. Excitement was generally discouraged, which may explain why, whenever excitement unexpectedly appeared, people paid very close attention. One spring morning, a small monastery found itself at the centre of what seemed to be a genuine miracle. It began innocently enough. A handful of young travellers passing through the region had spent the previous evening in a nearby tavern. Like many groups of young men throughout history, they reached that dangerous point where confidence had become directly proportional to the amount of ale consumed. Someone proposed a joke, someone else agreed. History has rarely benefited from those two sentences appearing together. During the night, they secretly climbed a hill overlooking the monastery and carefully arranged dozens of candles around an old wooden cross. Before dawn, when the valley was still wrapped in mist, they lit every candle. From below, the glowing cross appeared to float above the morning fog. It was a breathtaking sight. One elderly farmer spotted it first. Convinced he had witnessed a heavenly sign, he hurried to tell the monks. Soon villagers climbed the hillside to see the mysterious light for themselves. By sunrise, whispers of a miracle had spread across the countryside faster than fresh bread disappeared at a harvest festival. Pilgrims began arriving within days. Some came seeking healing. Others came searching for answers. A few simply wanted to make absolutely certain they weren't missing the biggest miracle of the century. The monastery, meanwhile, found itself completely overwhelmed. The brothers had never claimed a miracle had occurred. In fact, they repeatedly urged caution, reminding visitors that extraordinary claims required careful investigation. Unfortunately, once a good story begins travelling, catching it becomes considerably harder than releasing it. People donated food, others donated livestock. Several wealthy nobles offered generous gifts to the monastery, hoping divine favour might notice their remarkable generosity. It was, admittedly, excellent fundraising. Not intentionally, of course. The monks themselves were becoming increasingly confused. After several days, church officials arrived to investigate. Unlike excited pilgrims, bishops possessed years of experience dealing with miraculous claims. They asked careful questions, inspected the hilltop, interviewed witnesses, and generally behaved like medieval detectives, only with significantly better robes. Eventually, someone noticed melted candle wax scattered around the old cross. The mystery unravelled surprisingly quickly. The travellers who had staged the glowing display were eventually identified after one of them made the classic mistake committed by pranksters throughout history. He bragged about it. Apparently, he believed confessing the joke in a crowded tavern was safer than keeping it secret. It was not. When questioned, the young men admitted they had only wanted to surprise local villagers with a harmless illusion. They never imagined hundreds of pilgrims would appear, donations would pour in, and senior church officials would become personally involved. Their prank had grown far beyond their control. The punishment was far less amusing than the joke. The travellers were publicly reprimanded, ordered to perform acts of penance, and became locally famous for all the wrong reasons. More importantly, the incident made genuine reports of miracles harder to believe for years afterward, leaving many honest monks frustrated by a joke they had never asked to join. The pranksters had hoped to create one unforgettable morning. Instead, they created months of confusion. It's another reminder that in medieval Europe, pretending something was miraculous was rather like pretending you had discovered buried treasure. Sooner or later, everyone showed up with questions, and very few of them arrived carrying a sense of humour. If medieval pranksters had been asked to choose the perfect accomplice, many would probably have selected a goose. Not because geese were obedient, quite the opposite. A goose possesses the remarkable ability to wake an entire neighbourhood, chase fully grown adults with complete confidence, and somehow convince everyone involved that it is the victim. Medieval people knew this perfectly well, which made the birds ideal partners for anyone looking to create unforgettable chaos. One noble household learned that lesson the hard way. The castle was preparing for one of its grandest feasts of the year. Important guests had travelled for days to attend. Servants polished silver platters until they reflected candlelight like mirrors. Cooks had spent hours roasting meat over enormous hearths, while bakers carried fresh loaves from blazing ovens. Every tapestry had been carefully hung, every bench arranged, and every goblet placed exactly where tradition demanded. In short, everything was organised, which meant it was only a matter of time before someone ruined it. A pair of young pages, whose official duties apparently left far too much free time, decided the banquet lacked one important ingredient: entertainment. Sneaking into the castle's courtyard before the guests arrived, they quietly rounded up half a dozen particularly energetic geese from the nearby farm. Their plan was beautifully simple. Release the birds during the feast. Watch what happens. They expected a few startled nobles, perhaps some spilled wine, and a story they could laugh about for years. Instead, they unleashed feathery anarchy. Just as musicians began performing and servants carried in the enormous roasted boar, the pages opened the basket. The geese burst into the great hall like tiny, angry cavalry. One immediately flapped onto the high table. Another flew directly into a servant carrying a tray of steaming meat pies. A third became deeply offended by a nobleman's expensive velvet cloak and launched a completely unprovoked attack. Within seconds, dignity abandoned the castle entirely. Guests leaped from benches. Servants dropped platters. Dogs began chasing birds. Birds began chasing dogs. One terrified goose somehow landed inside the musician's corner, causing the harp player to produce what historians would probably describe as an experimental performance. Meanwhile, the lord of the castle attempted to maintain order. It is surprisingly difficult to give authoritative commands while dodging an aggressive bird determined to peck your boots. Wine splashed across embroidered clothing worth small fortunes. Candles toppled. Several decorative platters shattered across the stone floor. One elderly knight reportedly climbed onto a bench to escape the birds, an act that permanently damaged his reputation far more than his knees. The pages, hidden behind a pillar, were laughing so hard they could barely breathe. Unfortunately, laughter has an unfortunate habit of attracting attention. A kitchen servant recognised them almost immediately. The birds were eventually caught after what witnesses described as the longest 20 minutes in castle history. The feast resumed, but the mood had changed completely. Instead of discussing politics and alliances, everyone spent the evening picking feathers from their clothing. The 2 pages were dragged before the Lord. He was not amused. They spent the following weeks performing every unpleasant chore imaginable, cleaning stables, hauling water, scrubbing kitchens, and repairing the damage their brilliant idea had caused. The geese, meanwhile, received no punishment whatsoever. They wandered back to the farm exactly as they had arrived, completely convinced they had won. To be fair, they probably had. Love letters have caused trouble throughout history. In the Middle Ages, however, they possessed a special kind of destructive power. A single handwritten note could ruin an engagement, ignite a family feud, or convince 2 noble houses that betrayal was quietly unfolding beneath their own roofs. All before lunch. Unlike today, letters were rare, personal, and difficult to fake convincingly. Most people couldn't read or write, which meant that every written message carried unusual importance. If someone received a sealed letter bearing the correct crest or signature, there was every reason to believe it was genuine. That made forged letters the medieval equivalent of lighting a candle inside a powder magazine. One story tells of 2 young squires serving rival noble families. They were close friends despite their master's constant political competition. Like many young men with entirely too much confidence and entirely too little judgment, they convinced themselves they had invented the funniest prank imaginable. One evening, after borrowing a few scraps of expensive parchment and carefully copying the handwriting of a household secretary, they composed a passionate love letter. It wasn't addressed to a servant. It wasn't addressed to an unmarried noblewoman. It was addressed to the wife of an influential lord. The letter spoke of secret meetings, stolen glances across banquet tables, and promises to meet beneath the old oak tree outside the castle walls after sunset. To make the joke even more convincing, they signed it with the name of another powerful noble who happened to be attending court that very week. The plan, at least in their minds, was wonderfully simple. The lady would read the letter. She would immediately recognize it as nonsense. Everyone would laugh. The parchment would probably end up in the fireplace. Instead, the letter was discovered by her husband. Comedy ended right there. The Lord read every line twice, then a 3rd time. His face reportedly became so pale that one servant wondered whether he might faint. Another quietly decided it was an excellent moment to leave the room entirely. Experience suggested that angry nobles were best appreciated from a considerable distance. Within hours, accusations began flying across the castle. The supposedly guilty noble was confronted during dinner. He denied writing the letter. The husband insisted he was lying. Guests who had arrived expecting a pleasant evening of music and roasted venison suddenly found themselves watching 2 armed aristocrats shouting at each other across the great hall. Quite a dramatic improvement over entertainment provided by minstrels. The lady herself protested that she had never seen the letter before. Unfortunately, jealousy has never been famous for listening carefully. Servants began whispering. Neighbours invented details that had never happened. Before long, people confidently discussed secret romances that existed only because 2 bored squires possessed remarkably poor decision-making skills. The prank had become a scandal. Eventually, one frightened servant admitted seeing the young men practicing signatures several days earlier. Under questioning, the squires confessed almost immediately. If there was one thing medieval merchants loved almost as much as making money, it was the thought that someone else might be making even more. Greed, it turns out, is wonderfully predictable. Markets across medieval Europe were noisy places where spices, cloth, livestock, wine, jewellery, and rumours changed hands with astonishing speed. A clever merchant could become wealthy through patience and hard work, or through convincing everyone else to chase the wrong opportunity. One prosperous trader found himself constantly surrounded by jealous competitors. Every successful sale seemed to attract another merchant, asking suspiciously friendly questions. Where did you buy this silk? Who supplies your pepper? How are you selling wine this cheaply? These were not casual conversations. They were medieval industrial espionage. After months of watching rivals copy his every move, the merchant decided it was time for a little entertainment. One afternoon, while unloading ordinary wooden crates into his warehouse, he made sure several competing traders were watching from across the square. He lowered his voice just enough to be overheard. "Be careful," he whispered dramatically to his assistant. "If anyone discovers what's hidden underneath, we're both finished." Nothing attracts attention quite like someone pretending they don't want attention. The assistant, who had thankfully been warned about the prank beforehand, nodded nervously and glanced around as though protecting an incredible secret. Within minutes, half the marketplace was watching. The merchant then ordered the mysterious crates locked away inside a storage room. Throughout the afternoon, he made several exaggerated visits to inspect them, each time looking increasingly pleased with himself. The performance was magnificent. Unfortunately for his competitors, there was absolutely nothing inside except old pottery and sacks of onions. By sunset, the rumours had already begun. Some claimed the merchant had discovered buried Roman gold. Others insisted he had acquired priceless Eastern jewels. One particularly imaginative storyteller confidently announced the crates contained relics brought back from the Holy Land. History has always demonstrated that when facts are unavailable, imagination happily volunteers. Over the following days, rival merchants became obsessed. Several quietly hired labourers to search nearby fields for buried treasure. Others began purchasing abandoned land outside the town, convinced hidden wealth lay beneath the soil. One man reportedly spent a small fortune digging up an old vineyard after hearing a completely invented story involving ancient coins and forgotten knights. He found exactly 3 rocks, all of them disappointingly ordinary. Meanwhile, the original merchant continued selling cloth and spices while struggling not to laugh every time another wagon loaded with shovels rolled past his shop. For nearly 2 weeks, the prank remained a complete success. Then someone decided to investigate properly. A local official, curious about the growing rumours, demanded permission to inspect the mysterious warehouse. The merchant had little choice but to agree. The crates were opened. Out came cracked pottery, dusty onions, several broken farming tools. Silence filled the room. One rival merchant stared at the onions for such a long time that witnesses later claimed he looked personally betrayed by vegetables. The truth spread through town almost as quickly as the original rumour. Some people admired the merchant's cleverness. His competitors admired considerably less. Several accused him of deliberately wasting their money and time. While no laws had technically been broken, friendship certainly had. Business partnerships quietly ended, and more than one customer chose to shop elsewhere for a while. The merchant had won the joke. He had also earned a collection of enemies with exceptionally long memories. It was another reminder that medieval pranks didn't always require swords, geese, or forged letters. Sometimes all you needed was a few empty crates, and the comforting knowledge that curiosity has always been humanity's most expensive hobby. Medieval tournaments were supposed to celebrate courage, skill, and honour. They also happened to attract enormous crowds, generous prizes, ambitious knights, and just enough wine to encourage spectacularly poor decisions. It was, in other words, the perfect setting for a prank. By the late Middle Ages, tournaments had become grand public spectacles. Colourful tents stretched across open fields. Merchants sold everything from roasted meat to polished armour. Musicians played cheerful tunes, and noble families gathered to watch armoured warriors crash into one another with remarkable enthusiasm. Safety regulations were optimistic. Among the competitors was a young knight with a reputation for being both talented and hopelessly mischievous. He had grown tired of hearing rivals boast that they could recognise any famous knight simply by the way he rode a horse or lowered a lance. "I could fool every one of them," he reportedly claimed. Those words have introduced countless bad ideas throughout history. Instead of entering under his own banner, he secretly borrowed another knight's shield and had his own coat of arms carefully covered beneath a plain design. Even his horse wore unfamiliar colours. Only a handful of close friends knew the truth. His plan was simple: compete anonymously, win a few matches, reveal his identity at the end. Everyone applauds. No one gets hurt. As medieval history repeatedly demonstrates, plans rarely survive first contact with other people. The tournament began. One after another, experienced knights challenged the mysterious newcomer. To everyone's surprise, the unknown competitor defeated several respected opponents with remarkable confidence. Almost immediately, rumours swept through the crowd. Some claimed he was a foreign champion. Others whispered that he must be a famous crusader returning from distant lands. One elderly noble confidently announced he had recognised the rider instantly. He had not. In fact, he named 3 different people before lunchtime. The mystery only made the crowd more excited. Each victory added another layer to the legend. Even the disguised knight began enjoying the attention perhaps a little too much. He bowed dramatically after each contest, refusing every question about his identity, while allowing increasingly ridiculous stories to circulate. Apparently, he had forgotten that medieval nobles disliked being fooled almost as much as they disliked losing. Trouble arrived during the final joust. The disguised knight unhorsed one of the tournament's most respected champions, sending the veteran crashing spectacularly into the dirt before hundreds of cheering spectators. The crowd erupted. The defeated knight did not. When the winner finally removed his helmet and revealed his identity, laughter spread through sections of the audience. Some applauded the clever deception. Others looked horrified. The defeated champion stood slowly, brushing dust from his expensive armour. His face suggested he was carefully considering several illegal solutions to the problem. He accused the prankster of dishonourable conduct. The disguise, he argued, had prevented competitors from properly judging their opponent. Had they known who he truly was, they would have prepared differently. Whether that was actually true hardly mattered. Honour had been bruised far more severely than anyone's body. Arguments broke out among nobles. Judges debated whether the victories should count. Friends took opposing sides. What had begun as a harmless joke about mistaken identity now threatened the reputation of the entire tournament. Eventually, officials allowed the results to stand, but publicly criticised the knight for turning a contest of honour into a comedy performance. The prankster kept his trophy. He also gained a reputation for cleverness, and for being just untrustworthy enough that many future opponents politely declined his invitations to friendly competitions. After all, once someone tricks you while wearing 80 pounds of steel, you become surprisingly interested in reading the rules very carefully. A medieval marketplace was a masterpiece of controlled chaos. Before sunrise, merchants rolled in carts filled with vegetables, smoked fish, fresh bread, barrels of ale, bolts of cloth, and cages full of chickens that had very strong opinions about being transported. By mid-morning, every inch of the square buzzed with bargaining, shouting, laughter, and the occasional argument over whether a cabbage was truly worth that much. Into this carefully balanced confusion, someone introduced a pig. Not because the pig had business to conduct, because someone thought it would be funny. The culprit was a butcher's apprentice named Martin, a cheerful young man who possessed two undeniable qualities. He worked hard. He made terrible decisions whenever his friends were watching. The local market inspector had developed a reputation for being painfully strict. He measured bread loaves with wooden rulers, inspected scales twice a day, fined merchants for blocking walkways, and seemed personally offended whenever anyone smiled before noon. Naturally, nobody liked him. So Martin decided to improve everyone's morning. His plan was beautifully simple. Borrow one of the butcher's largest pigs, release it just as the inspector began his daily rounds, watch the chaos. The pig, however, had clearly prepared its own strategy. The moment Martin untied the rope, the animal sprinted into the crowded marketplace with astonishing speed. It darted between vegetable stalls, squeezed beneath wagons, and barreled directly through a display of apples. The apples flew everywhere. Children cheered. The fruit seller did not. The inspector spun around just in time to see nearly 50 apples rolling across the square like tiny wooden wheels. Before he could react, the pig charged between his legs. The poor man landed flat on his back. The crowd froze. Then someone laughed, then another. Within seconds, the entire marketplace echoed with laughter as the inspector struggled to stand while chasing a pig that appeared to consider the entire event excellent exercise. The chase grew increasingly ridiculous. A baker abandoned his oven to block one street. The pig ignored him completely. A fishmonger attempted to corner the animal with two large baskets. The pig chose violence. Fish scattered across the cobblestones. Several cats immediately declared this the greatest day of their lives. Meanwhile, Martin had stopped laughing. The pig was no longer following any recognizable pattern. Instead, it discovered the cloth merchants. One expensive fabric stand collapsed, then another. Brightly dyed wool landed in muddy puddles. A barrel of ale tipped over. A frightened donkey broke loose from its cart. Now there were two animals running through the market. The inspector looked as though he was reconsidering every decision that had led him to this profession. After nearly half an hour, the pig was finally captured by three exhausted farmers using ropes, remarkable teamwork, and what one witness later described as language unsuitable for church. Silence gradually returned. Then everyone began counting the damage. Broken stalls, ruined cloth, crushed vegetables, spilled ale, missing chickens. To this day, no one seems entirely certain where the chickens went. Martin confessed almost immediately, mainly because several hundred people had watched him release the pig. His punishment was swift. For weeks afterward, he worked without pay repairing damaged stalls, compensating angry merchants, and cleaning the marketplace every morning before sunrise. Ironically, he spent much of that time chasing the very same pig around the butcher's yard. The animal never seemed to recognize him, or perhaps it did. Either way, it always looked suspiciously pleased to see him. There were few people in medieval Europe more trusted than a royal messenger. When one rode through the gates carrying the king's seal, people paid attention. Castles opened their doors. Town officials gathered immediately. Orders were read aloud without delay. After all, ignoring a genuine command from the crown could end a career, or, depending on the king, end considerably more than that, which is exactly why pretending to be one was an exceptionally terrible idea. The prank began with a young nobleman named Hugh, who had developed a reputation for clever jokes and an unfortunate inability to recognize when one had gone far enough. His closest friend insisted they could fool the nearby town for an afternoon. "We'll deliver one ridiculous order," Hugh laughed. They'll realise it's nonsense. Everyone will laugh. History once again declined the invitation. Borrowing an old riding cloak, a borrowed horse, and a wax seal that looked just convincing enough from a distance, Hugh galloped toward the market town shortly after sunrise. Dust covered his boots, his horse was sweating, and he wore the serious expression common to men carrying very important news. Fortunately, acting confident has always been surprisingly persuasive. The town bailiff hurried to greet him. "The king sends urgent instructions," Hugh announced, holding up the sealed letter. The bailiff bowed immediately. No one questioned him. The letter contained several royal commands. Every merchant was to close their shop before noon. Every able-bodied man was to report to the town square carrying a shovel. The mayor was ordered to prepare lodging for a group of royal inspectors arriving the following morning. And, for reasons known only to Hugh's imagination, every church bell was to ring exactly 7 times at midday. The officials wasted no time. Messengers sprinted through the streets announcing the orders. Shopkeepers reluctantly closed profitable businesses. Labourers abandoned construction projects. Farmers left their fields. Within 2 hours, hundreds of confused townspeople stood in the square, holding shovels and staring at one another. Nobody knew why. Nobody wanted to be the first person to question the king. Meanwhile, the mayor desperately prepared for distinguished visitors who did not exist. Beds were cleaned, food was purchased, extra barrels of ale were delivered. The local baker worked through the afternoon, producing enough bread to feed guests who were, at that very moment, enjoying the remarkable experience of not existing. Then came the bells. 7 loud rings echoed across the valley. People looked around expectantly. Nothing happened. No inspectors arrived. No royal escort appeared. No explanation followed. The confusion slowly transformed into suspicion. The mayor carefully examined the letter once more. Something seemed slightly unusual. The handwriting looked unfamiliar. The royal seal wasn't quite right. The wording sounded oddly informal for official business. One sentence even ended with what appeared to be an ink blot, shaped suspiciously like a chicken. Royal scribes generally maintained higher standards. A real royal messenger happened to arrive the following day, carrying completely unrelated correspondence. When shown the mysterious letter, he needed only a few seconds before shaking his head. "The king," he said calmly, "has absolutely no interest in your shovels." The truth spread quickly. Hugh's identity wasn't difficult to discover. Too many people had seen him arrive, and one stable boy happily remembered lending him the horse, in exchange for a promise that something funny was about to happen. The authorities were considerably less amused. Hugh was fined heavily, publicly reprimanded, and ordered to reimburse the town for the unnecessary expenses caused by his little performance. The mayor never forgave him. Neither did the baker, who spent 3 days trying to sell enough extra bread to avoid feeding half the county for free. The prank had lasted a single afternoon. The embarrassment lingered for years. It became a useful lesson throughout the region. Pretending to speak for the king was rather like borrowing the crown itself. It might fit for a moment, but eventually someone would notice it wasn't yours. Life inside a medieval monastery followed an almost perfectly predictable rhythm. The bells rang. The monks prayed. They worked in the gardens, copied manuscripts, brewed ale, tended vineyards, cared for travellers, prayed again, ate simple meals, prayed yet again, and somehow still found time for more praying before finally going to bed. Excitement was generally discouraged, which perhaps explains why, whenever something unusual happened, everyone noticed immediately. One monastery, famous for producing excellent wine from its hillside vineyards, was preparing for the feast day of a beloved saint. Unlike ordinary meals, feast days allowed the brothers to enjoy better food, fresh bread, roasted fish, and perhaps most importantly, generous cups of their own carefully crafted wine. After months of discipline, everyone looked forward to it. One younger monk, Brother Thomas, believed the celebration had become too enthusiastic. Several older brothers seemed considerably more interested in the wine than in the saint. Thomas decided they needed a gentle lesson in moderation. Unfortunately, he also believed the best way to teach that lesson was through a prank. Late the evening before the feast, while the monastery slept, Thomas quietly rolled several barrels of wine out of the cellar and hid them inside an unused storage building behind the orchard. His plan was beautifully simple. The cellar would appear empty. The brothers would assume the wine had been stolen. Everyone would briefly panic. Then Thomas would reveal the barrels before dinner. Everyone would laugh and perhaps appreciate their blessings a little more. It was, admittedly, an optimistic plan. The following morning, the cellar keeper descended the stone steps carrying a lantern. A few moments later, horrified shouting echoed through the monastery. "The wine is gone!" Within minutes, nearly every monk crowded into the cellar. The shelves stood empty. The barrels had vanished. Silence filled the room. This was no ordinary inconvenience. Wine represented months of work, planting vines, tending grapes, harvesting, pressing, fermenting, storing, and praying that everything had gone according to God's plan rather than the weather's. One elderly monk crossed himself. Another looked ready to cry. The abbot immediately ordered the gates closed. No one was to leave. The brothers searched every building, questioned every servant, and even inspected wagon tracks outside the monastery walls. Suspicion spread with astonishing speed. Had thieves entered during the night? Had a local lord stolen the barrels? One nervous novice quietly wondered whether the devil himself had developed a taste for monastery wine. The older monks assured him that if Satan wanted to tempt them, he would probably begin with something stronger. Meanwhile, Brother Thomas watched the investigation grow larger every hour. This was no longer amusing. Travellers who had planned to attend the feast arrived only to discover anxious monks searching bushes instead of preparing lunch. Local villagers soon heard rumours that robbers were attacking monasteries throughout the region. The story spread remarkably fast. By afternoon, even nearby estates had begun warning servants to guard their own food supplies. Thomas finally realised his small joke had somehow become a regional crime investigation. His conscience gave up before the search party did. Gathering the courage he no longer possessed that morning, he approached the abbot and quietly confessed everything. The monks followed him to the old storage shed. Inside sat every barrel exactly where he had left them. The relief was immediate. The laughter, not so much. Brother Thomas spent the next several months assigned to the monastery's least desirable duties, cleaning kitchens, hauling water, tending pigs, and helping in the vineyards whose wine he had nearly convinced everyone had disappeared forever. The feast eventually went ahead. The wine tasted just as good. But whenever Brother Thomas carried a barrel afterward, someone invariably smiled and asked, "You're putting it back this time, aren't you?" Every medieval castle had its ghost stories. Some claimed a headless knight wandered the battlements after midnight. Others insisted a lady in white appeared whenever tragedy approached. Nearly every old fortress possessed at least one mysterious tower that sensible people avoided after sunset. Whether anyone truly believed the stories hardly mattered. Nobody was particularly eager to test them. One castle in northern Europe had recently welcomed a wealthy noble family from another region. They had purchased the estate despite repeated warnings from the local villagers. "They say it's haunted." The new owner laughed. "I fought in 3 wars. I'm not afraid of old stories." His servants, however, were considerably less confident. Among them were 3 mischievous stable boys who had grown up hearing every frightening legend about the castle. One rainy evening, they decided it would be amusing to convince the newcomers that the ghosts were still very much at home. Their plan was surprisingly elaborate. They hid lanterns behind narrow windows in an abandoned tower, so strange lights would appear to drift through the darkness. They tied long ropes beneath the floorboards of an unused hallway, allowing heavy wooden doors to swing open by themselves. Finally, they recruited one unfortunate kitchen boy to walk through the courtyard, wrapped in a white bedsheet shortly after midnight. Looking back, perhaps someone should have questioned that final detail. As darkness settled over the castle, the performance began. A servant carrying firewood glanced toward the old tower and froze. "There," he whispered. "The light." Others looked up. Sure enough, pale golden lights appeared where no one should have been. A cold wind happened to sweep through the courtyard at exactly the wrong moment. Perfect timing. Soon afterward, one of the great oak doors slowly creaked open by itself. Several maids screamed. 2 guards immediately drew their swords. Neither appeared entirely convinced swords were the proper weapon against spirits, but they were all they had. Then came the final act. The kitchen boy emerged from the mist, wrapped head to toe in his white sheet, arms stretched awkwardly into the air. For approximately 5 seconds, everything worked perfectly. Then disaster arrived. One elderly guard, who had spent 30 years fighting very real enemies, didn't pause to investigate supernatural possibilities. He simply charged. The terrified kitchen boy shrieked, dropped the sheet, and sprinted across the courtyard faster than anyone believed possible, while the equally terrified guard chased him, convinced the ghost was attempting to escape. The stable boys, watching from behind a wall, laughed so hard they accidentally knocked over one of the hidden lanterns. It crashed into a pile of old straw. Within moments, smoke drifted into the night sky. Now the castle genuinely had an emergency. The alarm bell rang. Servants formed bucket lines from the well. Guests rushed outside half-dressed, convinced evil spirits had set the castle ablaze. Ironically, they were only half wrong. Fortunately, the small fire was extinguished before it reached the wooden buildings nearby, but the prank was over. The stable boys confessed almost immediately, mainly because one of them was still holding the rope attached to the haunted door. The lord of the castle was furious, not because they had frightened his household, but because they had nearly burned down a fortress that had survived centuries of sieges, storms, and wars, only to be threatened by 3 boys with entirely too much imagination. If you happened to stroll through Rome during the middle of December, expecting the usual order and discipline, you would have assumed the empire had quietly collapsed overnight. Respectable senators wandered the streets wearing colourful caps instead of solemn expressions. Wealthy merchants laughed with complete strangers. Dice games, normally frowned upon in polite society, appeared on nearly every table. Slaves spoke freely to their masters without fearing punishment. Everywhere you looked, people shouted the same cheerful greeting, "Io Saturnalia!" For one remarkable week, Rome intentionally turned itself upside down. Saturnalia honoured Saturn, the ancient god of agriculture, whose mythical reign was remembered as a golden age when all people supposedly lived as equals. Whether that peaceful paradise had ever existed hardly mattered. Romans loved the idea enough to recreate a small piece of it every winter. The celebration began at Saturn's temple in the Roman Forum. Priests offered sacrifices before crowds gathered beneath garlands of evergreen branches decorating streets, homes, and public buildings. The woolen bindings normally wrapped around Saturn's statue were ceremonially removed, symbolizing freedom itself being temporarily released. Once the ritual ended, so did much of Rome's normal routine. Businesses often closed. Courts suspended many legal proceedings. Schools dismissed their students, who probably considered this proof that the gods occasionally made sensible decisions. Government officials delayed serious business whenever possible, because convincing people to focus on taxes while they were exchanging presents and drinking wine was usually an impossible task. Perhaps the most famous tradition took place inside Roman households. Masters and slaves exchanged roles, at least symbolically. In many homes, wealthy citizens prepared meals and served their own household servants at dinner. Slaves were encouraged to joke openly, speak their minds, and enjoy luxuries normally reserved for their social superiors. No one truly believed Roman society had become equal for a week, but the ritual served as a pressure valve, allowing tensions to ease before everyday hierarchy returned. The dinner tables themselves became extraordinary scenes of abundance. Roast pork, fresh bread, olives, cheeses, figs, honey cakes, nuts, and endless cups of wine covered every available surface. Families invited neighbours, friends arrived unexpectedly, musicians wandered from house to house, and laughter drifted into narrow streets illuminated by hundreds of oil lamps and flickering torches. Gift-giving formed another beloved custom. Romans exchanged small presents called sigillaria, often tiny clay figurines, candles, writing tablets, or humorous trinkets that cost little but carried personal meaning. Expensive gifts certainly existed, but clever or amusing presents often earned greater appreciation than lavish displays of wealth. Even 2,000 years ago, nobody really needed another decorative bowl. As darkness settled over the city, Saturnalia truly came alive. Taverns overflowed with cheerful customers, music echoed through crowded neighbourhoods, and friendly gambling games continued well into the night. Dice rolled across wooden tables, despite laws that usually prohibited such entertainment outside the festival. The entire city seemed determined to postpone bedtime for as long as humanly possible. For those few magical nights, Rome forgot its usual seriousness. The empire that conquered continents chose instead to celebrate laughter, generosity, and glorious disorder beneath the glow of countless torches. And as the festival reached its height, another kind of nighttime spectacle was already preparing to keep the eternal city awake. If Saturnalia allowed Romans to laugh at the rules, Lupercalia reminded them that some traditions were far older than the empire itself. By the middle of February, the festive decorations had long disappeared. Daily life had returned to its familiar rhythm, and respectable citizens once again behaved as respectable citizens were expected to behave. Then came Lupercalia, and Rome willingly embraced one of its strangest nights. Unlike Saturnalia's cheerful feasting, Lupercalia felt ancient, mysterious, and just a little unsettling. The festival centred around the Lupercal, a cave on the slopes of the Palatine Hill. According to Roman legend, this was where the she-wolf had nursed Romulus and Remus after they were abandoned as infants. Without that wolf, there would have been no founders. Without the founders, there would have been no Rome. So every year, the city returned to the place where its story supposedly began. Before dawn, crowds gathered outside the sacred site while priests known as the Luperci prepared for the ceremony. They sacrificed goats, symbols of fertility, and a dog representing protection for the flocks. To modern eyes, it sounds like an unusual combination. To the Romans, it represented prosperity, purification, and survival. Ancient religion rarely concerned itself with appearing sensible 20 centuries later. After the sacrifices, the priests touched the foreheads of two young noblemen with a knife stained in sacrificial blood, before wiping it away with wool dipped in milk. The young men were then expected to laugh immediately. No one fully agrees why. Some ancient writers believed it symbolized moving from death to life, while others admitted they were not entirely sure either. Even the Romans occasionally participated in traditions simply because their ancestors had always done so. The priests then cut strips of goatskin into narrow thongs called februa. Wearing little more than these skins around their waists, they burst from the cave and began running through the streets surrounding the Palatine. Citizens packed every corner of the route. Vendors sold bread, roasted chestnuts, wine, and sweet cakes, while children climbed walls for a better view. The excitement spread quickly through the city, and before long thousands followed the runners carrying torches that turned the evening streets into rivers of flickering light. Women often stepped forward willingly, extending their hands or backs to receive a gentle strike from the goatskin strips. Far from being an insult, many believed the touch would bring fertility, healthy pregnancies, or an easier childbirth. Roman society placed enormous importance on family and heirs, making such blessings highly desirable. As darkness settled over the hills, music, drinking, and storytelling continued long after the official ritual had ended. The race itself lasted only a short time, but the celebration lingered well into the night. Once again, Rome proved remarkably talented at turning a religious ceremony into an all-night gathering. And while Lupercalia honoured the city's legendary birth, the next celebration would reveal another Roman obsession entirely: the irresistible thrill of public spectacle. If Lupercalia filled Rome's streets with runners and torchlight, the Circus Maximus showed what happened when nearly the entire city gathered in one place. Nothing captured the Roman imagination quite like chariot racing. Gladiators may receive the attention today, but for the average Roman citizen, the greatest excitement often came from 4 horses charging around a dusty track at terrifying speed. And on festival days, those races rarely ended when the sun went down. The Circus Maximus stretched through the valley between the Palatine and Aventine hills, large enough to hold well over 100,000 spectators, with later renovations increasing its capacity even further. Imagine an enormous stadium packed tighter than a modern championship final, except everyone had also brought food, wine, loud opinions, and absolutely no intention of staying quiet. By early morning, the entrances overflowed. Bakers carried baskets of fresh bread through the crowds. Vendors roasted sausages over smoking braziers. Others sold olives, dried fruit, honey cakes, watered wine, and small souvenirs painted in the colours of the racing factions. Every citizen, from senators in fine white togas to labourers still dusty from work, found themselves squeezed shoulder to shoulder. The excitement centred on 4 famous racing teams: the Blues, Greens, Reds, and Whites. These were not simply sporting clubs. Loyal supporters followed them with astonishing passion. Families argued over them. Friends placed bets on them. Some spectators probably claimed they had supported the Greens before it became fashionable. Human nature has always enjoyed pretending it discovered success first. Each race featured 4-horse chariots hurtling around the long central barrier known as the spina. Drivers balanced precariously on lightweight vehicles, while reins wrapped around their waists allowed greater control. Unfortunately, they also made crashing considerably more dangerous. If a chariot overturned, the driver could be dragged behind panicked horses unless he managed to cut himself free with the knife every racer carried. The crowd reacted to every turn as though the fate of the empire depended upon it. Cheers erupted whenever a favourite gained ground. Groans spread through the stadium after collisions. Clouds of dust rose into the air, coating spectators, food, and expensive clothing alike. Nobody seemed particularly bothered. If your dinner contained a small amount of racetrack, you simply considered yourself fully immersed in the experience. Festival programs often included dozens of races spread throughout the day. Between events came musicians, acrobats, trained animals, comic performers, and ceremonial processions honouring the gods. The entertainment barely paused long enough for anyone to remember they had arrived shortly after sunrise. As evening approached, servants lit hundreds of oil lamps and towering torches around the massive arena. The glow reflected from polished marble, bronze statues, and brightly painted decorations, creating an almost magical atmosphere. Instead of emptying, many spectators stayed. Taverns surrounding the circus filled with racing fans, arguing over disputed victories, questionable betting decisions, and whether a particular driver had deliberately forced his rival into the barrier. Ancient sports debates were every bit as passionate as modern ones. Long after the final chariot crossed the finish line, laughter, music, and animated conversations spilled into Rome's streets. The races had ended, but the city was nowhere near ready for sleep. Soon another festival would prove that Romans needed neither horses nor competition to celebrate until dawn. Sometimes, flowers alone were enough. If the Circus Maximus celebrated speed and competition, the Floralia celebrated something far less predictable: spring itself. Held between the end of April and the beginning of May, this festival honoured Flora, the goddess of flowers, blossoms, and new growth. After months of cooler weather, Rome erupted into colour, fragrance, music, and laughter. It was a celebration that encouraged people to loosen their belts, forget their worries, and stay outside long after the stars had appeared. Unlike many solemn Roman religious festivals, Floralia was deliberately playful. The celebrations began with sacrifices at Flora's temple near the Circus Maximus, but formal ceremonies quickly gave way to entertainment. Streets filled with garlands woven from roses, violets, lilies, and fresh greenery. Public buildings were decorated with flowering branches, while citizens wore colourful clothing instead of the traditional white garments expected during more serious occasions. For once, looking respectable was not the priority. Looking cheerful was. The festival reflected the unpredictable energy of spring. Nature had survived another winter. Crops were beginning to grow. Orchards promised fruit in the coming months, and vineyards stretched fresh green shoots toward the sun. Rome understood that if agriculture failed, the empire suffered. Celebrating Flora was not simply about admiring flowers. It was about thanking the forces that kept everyone fed. As daylight faded, crowds gathered for theatrical performances, unlike those staged during more formal religious holidays. Comedies filled with exaggerated characters, clever jokes, ridiculous misunderstandings, and playful mockery delighted enormous audiences. Actors performed wearing brightly painted masks, while musicians accompanied every entrance with flutes, drums, and cymbals. The audience rarely sat quietly. People laughed, shouted advice to performers, applauded favourite scenes, and occasionally heckled actors who failed to impress. Roman theatre encouraged participation. Remaining silent through an entire performance would probably have seemed suspicious, as though you had accidentally wandered into the wrong festival. Animal displays also became part of the celebration. Ancient writers described rabbits, goats, deer, and even tame birds being released into public spaces as symbols of fertility and abundance. Children chased after them with delighted excitement, while adults watched with equal amusement. Catching one was rarely the point. Watching your neighbour unsuccessfully chase a rabbit through a crowded square provided perfectly acceptable entertainment. Food vendors took full advantage of the enormous crowds. Fresh cheeses, olives, roasted meats, honey pastries, figs, nuts, and cups of sweet wine circulated constantly through the streets. The aroma of roasting meat mixed with the scent of blooming flowers, creating an atmosphere that was equal parts marketplace and garden. As darkness settled across Rome, thousands of oil lamps illuminated balconies, temples, fountains, and porticos. Musicians gathered at crossroads, dancers performed in open squares, and friends wandered from celebration to celebration with little concern for the hour. Conversation flowed as freely as the wine, while laughter echoed through neighbourhoods that would normally have fallen quiet after sunset. Perhaps that was the true charm of Floralia. It reminded Romans that life was not measured solely by military victories, political speeches, or legal disputes. Sometimes the greatest luxury was simply enjoying a warm spring evening beneath blooming trees, surrounded by friends, music, and the comforting certainty that tomorrow's work could wait until tomorrow. Of course, not every Roman festival celebrated flowers and gentle laughter. Some honoured the gods with fire itself, filling the night sky with flickering flames that transformed the eternal city into a sea of dancing light. While Floralia filled Rome with flowers and laughter, another festival glowed with a quieter kind of light. There were no roaring chariot crowds or runners charging through the streets. Instead, Romans gathered around something they believed was even more important than entertainment: a single sacred flame that was never supposed to die. The Vestalia, celebrated each June, honoured Vesta, goddess of the hearth, home, and family. To modern visitors, a fireplace might seem an ordinary household feature. To a Roman, the hearth represented stability itself. If the fire burned, the family endured. If the sacred fire in Rome's temple remained alive, the city itself would continue to prosper. No pressure for the women tending it. At the centre of the festival stood the temple of Vesta in the Roman Forum. Unlike most temples, which housed impressive statues of their gods, this round sanctuary protected something far simpler: an eternal flame cared for by the Vestal Virgins. These priestesses dedicated decades of their lives to serving the goddess, living under strict rules while holding extraordinary respect within Roman society. For most of the year, ordinary Romans could not enter the temple's sacred inner space. During Vestalia, however, its doors opened to married women who arrived barefoot carrying offerings for the goddess. They brought fresh bread, cakes baked from the season's first grain, flowers and prayers for healthy families and peaceful homes. The streets leading toward the forum remained crowded throughout the day. Bakers considered the festival especially important because flour and bread depended upon the household hearth. Mills were decorated with garlands of flowers, while donkeys that normally spent their days grinding grain received an unexpected holiday. Their harnesses were adorned with colourful ribbons and fresh wreaths, transforming hard-working animals into rather confused festival participants. One suspects the donkeys appreciated the day off more than the decorations. As evening approached, Rome gradually changed character. The summer air cooled, and families emerged once more from their homes. Oil lamps appeared in windows overlooking narrow streets, while larger bronze lanterns illuminated public squares. The temple of Vesta itself glowed warmly, its eternal fire visible through the entrance, as priests and priestesses continued their sacred duties. Unlike the noisy celebrations of Saturnalia or the Circus Maximus, conversations during Vestalia were softer. Families walked together through the forum, children carried small lanterns, musicians played gentle melodies on flutes and lyres, and neighbours exchanged stories beneath the flickering light, It was less a carnival than a peaceful evening gathering shared by an entire city. The festival concluded with an important act of purification. The temple was carefully cleaned, and the accumulated sacred dust was carried to the Tiber River, where it was respectfully cast into the flowing water. Symbolically, the city released the burdens of another year and prepared for the months ahead with a renewed sense of order. Yet Rome was not always content with peaceful nights around sacred fires. Sometimes the city preferred spectacles that reached far beyond temple walls. Soon, thousands would climb hillsides carrying torches, filling the darkness with glowing processions that could be seen from nearly every corner of the eternal city. If the Vestalia offered gentle pools of firelight around the sacred hearth, other Roman celebrations turned the entire city into a river of flames. Romans had long understood something simple about festivals. Everything became more memorable after sunset if enough torches were involved. And fortunately for them, they had plenty of torches. Throughout the year, several religious festivals included nighttime processions that wound through Rome's streets. Priests, musicians, magistrates, citizens, and entire families walked together carrying blazing pine torches or bronze oil lamps. From the surrounding hills, the city appeared to shimmer beneath thousands of moving lights, almost as though the stars themselves had decided to spend an evening wandering among mortals. One of the most impressive of these ceremonies honoured Ceres, goddess of agriculture and grain. During certain rites, particularly those connected with her Greek counterpart Demeter, worshippers carried flaming torches through the darkness in remembrance of the goddess's desperate search for her daughter, Proserpina, after her abduction into the underworld. The story was familiar to nearly every Roman child. Ceres had searched the earth day and night with torches in her hands, refusing to rest until she found her daughter. Although the tale ended with a compromise that explained the changing seasons, the torchlight procession allowed ordinary citizens to symbolically join that ancient search. As twilight faded, groups gathered outside temples across the city. Priests offered prayers while attendants distributed freshly prepared torches wrapped tightly with cloth soaked in resin or wax. Once lit, they burned brightly, filling the air with the sharp scent of pine and smoke. Then the procession began. Musicians walked at the front, their flutes, horns and drums setting a slow, steady rhythm that echoed through narrow streets lined with curious spectators. Behind them came priests wearing spotless white robes, followed by magistrates carrying ceremonial staffs. Ordinary citizens filled the remaining spaces, creating an endless ribbon of flickering light that stretched far beyond the next intersection. People watched from balconies decorated with flowers and hanging lamps. Children leaned dangerously far over railings despite anxious parents pulling them back every few minutes. Shopkeepers stood outside their businesses, pausing their evening trade to observe the passing ceremony. Even travellers arriving after dark found themselves stopping in amazement as glowing processions silently crossed their path. The experience appealed to more than religion alone. There was something deeply comforting about walking beside neighbours beneath the warm glow of hundreds of flames. Conversations drifted quietly between friends, elderly couples walked arm in arm, and children proudly carried small lanterns under careful supervision. The entire city seemed united by a shared rhythm of footsteps and firelight. When the processions finally reached their destination, prayers and offerings concluded the sacred portion of the evening. But very few Romans hurried home. Taverns quickly filled, street musicians continued performing, and food sellers reopened their stalls to serve warm bread, roasted chestnuts, olives, cheese, and watered wine to hungry participants. Long after the official ceremonies had ended, the torches still burned across Rome's hills. The religious ritual had concluded, but like so many Roman festivals, the night itself refused to end. And nowhere was that love of staying awake more obvious than during the grand imperial celebrations. when an emperor could transform the entire capital into one enormous all-night party. Religious festivals brought Romans together through tradition. Imperial celebrations added something else entirely, spectacle on a scale that bordered on unbelievable. Whenever an emperor celebrated a great military victory, the opening of a magnificent building, or simply wished to remind everyone how generous he was, Rome transformed into one enormous festival that could last for days. And when the emperor was paying, very few people complained. The preparations often began weeks in advance. Streets were swept clean, public fountains polished, temples decorated with colourful banners, and triumphal arches draped in garlands of laurel. Workers hung thousands of oil lamps throughout the forum, while carpenters constructed temporary stages for musicians, actors, dancers, and public performers. Every district buzzed with anticipation. Nobody knew exactly what surprises awaited. At sunrise, enormous processions marched through the city. Soldiers displayed captured treasures from distant lands. Exotic animals from Africa or Asia fascinated crowds who had never seen such creatures before. Musicians filled the streets with the sounds of trumpets, horns, drums, and flutes, while priests offered prayers for Rome's continued prosperity. By afternoon, the celebrations spread into every available public space. Theatres presented free performances of comedies and tragedies. Acrobats balanced on ropes stretched above crowded squares. Jugglers tossed flaming torches into the air with enough confidence to reassure spectators that they had probably practiced beforehand. Magicians amazed children with clever illusions, while storytellers gathered circles of listeners eager to hear tales of heroes, monsters, and distant provinces. Meanwhile, the city's taverns did excellent business. Food sellers lined nearly every major street. The smell of roasting pork drifted through the forum, mixing with fresh bread pulled from communal ovens. Vendors offered grilled fish, olives, cheeses, honey cakes, dried figs, almonds, dates, sausages seasoned with herbs, and cups of diluted wine for thirsty festival goers. Wealthy citizens sometimes sponsored free public meals, distributing bread or coins as acts of generosity that also happened to improve their popularity. An entirely selfless gesture, naturally. If you lived in a medieval village and someone suggested you should go outside to clear your mind, your first reaction might have been, "I've been outside since sunrise." That was perfectly true. Medieval life unfolded almost entirely beneath the open sky. Fields, roads, markets, forests, rivers, and village squares formed the backdrop of everyday existence. Yet there was a surprising difference between working in nature and finding comfort in it. Ploughing a muddy field while worrying whether your wheat would survive the next frost was hardly relaxing. Sitting quietly beneath an oak tree after the day's labour was something else entirely. The people of the Middle Ages never spoke about mental health the way we do today. They had no psychologists, no wellness retreats, and certainly no inspirational signs reminding them to live, laugh, love. Medieval walls were generally occupied by far more practical decorations, such as drying onions. Even so, people understood something remarkably familiar. The natural world had a calming effect. As the evening church bells faded across the countryside, villagers often wandered beyond the last cottages without any urgent purpose. Narrow footpaths led through wildflower meadows buzzing with bees, over gentle hills dotted with sheep, or beside slow-moving streams whose steady sound drowned out the noise of daily life. There was no grand destination waiting at the end of these walks. The journey itself offered the reward. For farmers especially, these quiet moments mattered. A medieval peasant carried an astonishing number of worries. A poor harvest could mean hunger. Heavy rain might destroy months of work overnight. Livestock could fall ill, taxes still had to be paid, and every season brought new uncertainties. Life demanded constant attention. Nature asked for nothing. Many simply sat on grassy slopes overlooking their fields. They watched swallows dart through the evening sky, or listened to wind passing through rows of grain. The same landscape that had demanded exhausting labour during daylight appeared completely different at sunset. Colours softened, birds replaced the clatter of carts, and even familiar places felt strangely peaceful beneath the golden light. Rivers became favourite places to escape as well. The steady flow of water fascinated medieval people, just as it does today. Fishermen often lingered after finishing their work, watching reflections ripple across the surface. Children skipped stones while older villagers rested beneath willow trees whose branches gently brushed the water. The sound of a flowing stream required no explanation. It simply encouraged people to become still. Woodlands offered another kind of comfort. Although forests could certainly be dangerous after dark, their edges provided cool shade during warm afternoons. Travellers paused beneath towering beech or oak trees to eat bread and cheese before continuing their journey. Shepherds rested against ancient trunks while their flocks grazed nearby, enjoying one of the few occupations where watching sheep slowly wander across a hillside counted as productive work. Quite honestly, the sheep probably found the arrangement equally relaxing. Not everyone had the luxury of long walks, of course. Medieval life remained demanding, especially for the poor. But even brief moments mattered. Standing outside after supper, watching the sun disappear behind distant hills, breathing air scented with grass instead of smoke, or listening to birds settling into the trees offered a small but meaningful break from life's endless responsibilities. They may not have called it therapy, but after a difficult day, stepping quietly into the countryside was sometimes the closest thing the medieval world had to it. If the open countryside offered peace through wide horizons and quiet rivers, medieval monasteries created something far more deliberate. Behind thick stone walls lay carefully designed gardens where every flower, herb, tree, and pathway served a purpose. They were places of prayer, learning, medicine, and perhaps without anyone realizing it, remarkable sanctuaries for tired minds. A monastery garden was never planted by accident. Unlike the wild meadows outside village boundaries, these enclosed spaces reflected careful planning. Monks believed that tending a garden mirrored tending the soul. Pulling weeds encouraged patience. Pruning fruit trees taught discipline. Watering herbs reminded them that small acts performed faithfully could produce life in abundance. Every season brought fresh work, but rarely frantic work. The rhythm followed nature rather than the clock. The moment someone stepped through the garden gate, the world seemed to slow down. Stone walls blocked much of the outside noise. Instead of barking dogs, creaking wagons, or merchants arguing over prices, visitors heard bees drifting between lavender blossoms, birds nesting in apple trees, and fountains gently splashing into shallow pools. The scents changed throughout the year. In spring came violets and lilies. Summer filled the air with rosemary, sage, mint, and thyme. Autumn carried the sweet aroma of ripe pears and fallen apples. It was difficult to hurry through such a place. Most monastery gardens contained medicinal herbs alongside vegetables and fruit trees. Monks had inherited centuries of botanical knowledge from Roman texts, local traditions, and their own observations. Beds of chamomile, fennel, valerian, hyssop, and lemon balm grew beside onions, beans, cabbages, and leeks. Some plants eased digestion, others soothed headaches, while a few were believed to calm anxious thoughts or encourage restful sleep. Modern medicine has tested many of these herbs with varying results. Medieval monks, however, relied less on laboratories and more on generations of careful experience. If Brother Matthew drank a cup of lemon balm every evening and seemed noticeably less grumpy afterward, that was considered reasonably convincing evidence. The gardens also served as outdoor classrooms. Younger monks learned to identify hundreds of different plants, understand the changing seasons, and prepare simple remedies for both the monastery and nearby villagers. Knowledge passed quietly from one generation to the next, often while kneeling in damp soil beneath the morning sun. Many monasteries included covered walkways surrounding a central courtyard, known as a cloister. Here, monks walked slowly while praying or reflecting in silence. The paths formed a square, allowing endless peaceful circles without ever leaving the safety of the monastery. It may sound repetitive, but repetition was precisely the point. Each slow step encouraged steady breathing and quiet contemplation. You might call it pacing. The monks called it devotion. Visitors occasionally found themselves deeply affected by these peaceful spaces. Pilgrims stopping for the night often described monasteries as places where the constant worries of travel briefly disappeared. Even nobles accustomed to castles and banquets remarked upon the unusual calm found inside monastery walls. The gardens offered something wealth alone could not purchase: stillness. As beautiful as monastery gardens were, they represented only one carefully cultivated corner of nature. Beyond their walls stretched ancient forests that inspired very different emotions. They could comfort, inspire, frighten, and humble all at once, making them some of the most powerful landscapes in the medieval imagination. Leaving the monastery behind, the world changed almost immediately. The carefully trimmed herb beds disappeared. Stone pathways gave way to winding trails. Birds sang from branches that no gardener had ever pruned, and sunlight filtered through towering oaks in shifting patches that moved across the forest floor with every passing breeze. To medieval people, the forest was not simply a collection of trees. It was a world entirely its own. And like many old worlds, it inspired both fear and comfort. Medieval stories often portrayed forests as mysterious places where outlaws hid, wolves hunted, and travellers lost their way. Fairy tales placed witches in woodland cottages and wandering knights beneath ancient branches. Priests warned against becoming lost in the wilderness, both physically and spiritually. Yet these tales only reveal half the picture. For countless ordinary people, the forest was also a place of remarkable peace. Woodcutters, charcoal burners, shepherds, hunters, and herbal gatherers spent long hours beneath the trees. While their work was demanding, they also experienced something many villagers rarely enjoyed: silence. Once you ventured deeper into the woods, the sounds of church bells, barking dogs, and crowded markets gradually faded away. Instead came entirely different music. Leaves rustled high overhead as the wind passed through the canopy. Woodpeckers tapped patiently against old trunks. Streams hidden among moss-covered rocks provided a steady background melody, while birds called from unseen branches above. Even the occasional crack of a fallen twig reminded visitors that the forest was alive with creatures rarely seen, but constantly present. Modern scientists often speak about the calming effects of natural soundscapes. Medieval people never studied such ideas, but they certainly experienced them. Many paused simply to listen. The changing light added to the forest's peaceful atmosphere. Unlike open fields where the sun beat down relentlessly during summer, woodland paths remained pleasantly cool. Shafts of golden light slipped between branches, illuminating patches of ferns, wildflowers, and carpets of moss. Every few steps revealed a slightly different scene, as though nature quietly rearranged its artwork while no one was looking. The air itself felt different. Dense forests remained noticeably cooler than nearby villages. The smell of damp earth mixed with pine needles, mushrooms, wild garlic, and fallen leaves created an aroma unlike anywhere else. After spending hours surrounded by smoke from cooking fires and crowded cottages, breathing deeply beneath ancient trees must have felt wonderfully refreshing. Herbalists valued these woodlands for another reason. Forests provided countless medicinal plants difficult to find elsewhere. Elder trees, hawthorn, foxglove, yarrow, wild mint, and countless other species grew naturally beneath the canopy. Experienced gatherers walked slowly, observing every patch of ground with remarkable patience. Gathering herbs was rarely rushed. Careful observation mattered more than speed. Perhaps that slow pace became part of the healing. Even nobles sought comfort beneath the trees. Hunting expeditions often included long pauses where riders rested beside streams or beneath enormous oaks, while servants prepared meals. Not every moment in the forest involved chasing deer across the countryside. Sometimes people simply admired the landscape stretching quietly around them. The medieval forest demanded respect rather than conquest. It reminded every visitor that they occupied only a small place within a much older world. Among trees that had stood for centuries, human worries could briefly seem much smaller than they had back in the village. And if the forests offered deep shade and thoughtful silence, the rivers that flowed from them offered something equally soothing: the endless comfort of moving water. If the forests invited medieval people to slow their footsteps, rivers encouraged them to slow their thoughts. Long before anyone spoke about mindfulness or relaxation techniques, people discovered that sitting beside moving water had a curious effect. Worries rarely disappeared entirely, but they often seemed to drift downstream for a little while. Medieval men and women may never have explained why they felt calmer beside a river, yet they returned to those places again and again. Perhaps some comforts need no explanation. Water shaped nearly every aspect of medieval life. Rivers provided drinking water, powered mills, carried merchants and pilgrims, supplied fish for the table, and connected distant towns through winding waterways. Entire villages grew beside streams, because survival depended upon them. But once the day's work was finished, those same rivers became places where people rested rather than laboured. The busiest hours came early in the morning. Women washed clothes along the banks while exchanging news with neighbours. Millers inspected the steady current that turned their great wooden wheels. Fishermen checked woven traps set the previous evening, hoping to find trout, pike, or perch waiting inside. Children skipped happily along muddy banks, searching for smooth stones, or watching ducks glide effortlessly across the water. By late afternoon, however, the atmosphere changed. The work gradually faded, and the rivers grew quieter. Shepherds brought their flocks to drink before leading them home. Travellers paused to refill leather water flasks and soak tired feet after long days on dusty roads. Farmers rested beneath willow trees whose long branches dipped lazily toward the current. Many simply sat without speaking, watching leaves float away until they disappeared around the next bend. The river never seemed in a hurry. That alone made it worth observing. Medieval writers occasionally compared flowing water to the passage of human life. Streams moved steadily forward without stopping, carrying away fallen branches, autumn leaves, and yesterday's rain alike. Monks often reflected upon this symbolism during quiet walks, seeing the river as a reminder that sorrow, hardship, and even joy were temporary visitors. Nothing remained still forever. For pilgrims, rivers offered moments of welcome relief during exhausting journeys. Medieval roads were rough, often muddy and surprisingly unforgiving on both feet and tempers. Reaching a clear stream meant fresh drinking water, a chance to wash away dust, cool aching muscles, and prepare a simple meal before continuing onward. Many pilgrimage accounts describe peaceful evenings spent beside river banks where the only sounds came from flowing water and distant birds settling into the reeds. Not every riverbank was silent, of course. Watermills created their own comforting rhythm. The slow creaking of massive wooden wheels, the steady splash of water striking paddles, and the gentle rumble of grinding millstones formed a soundtrack familiar across medieval Europe. While millers remained busy, nearby villagers often found the sound strangely reassuring. As long as the wheel kept turning, grain became flour, bread remained possible, and another season of life continued. Even castle gardens frequently included fountains, fish ponds, or narrow channels of running water. Noble families understood that the gentle murmur of flowing streams transformed enclosed courtyards into places of remarkable tranquility. Water cooled the summer air, attracted birds, reflected the changing sky, and softened the otherwise rigid geometry of stone walls. Whether beside a tiny woodland brook or a mighty river carrying ships toward distant cities, medieval people repeatedly sought out moving water when they desired a moment of quiet. And beyond those rivers stretched another landscape that offered a different kind of healing altogether, not through flowing water or towering trees, but through wide open fields where the horizon itself seemed capable of lifting a weary spirit. If rivers calmed the mind with gentle movement, open landscapes offered something entirely different. They gave medieval people room to breathe. Most villagers spent much of their lives surrounded by narrow cottages, fenced fields, workshops, smoke and crowded streets. Even castles, for all their grandeur, were enclosed by thick stone walls designed to keep enemies out, rather than provide pleasant scenery. It is hardly surprising that many people found comfort in climbing a nearby hill where the world suddenly opened before them. Sometimes the best view required nothing more than a short walk. Outside, nearly every medieval settlement stretched rolling meadows and gentle hills covered with wild grasses and seasonal flowers. In spring, they shimmered with daisies, buttercups, poppies, and cornflowers. Summer painted them deep green beneath endless blue skies, while autumn transformed the fields into warm shades of gold and amber. Winter, though quieter, possessed its own peaceful beauty as frost sparkled across the grass beneath the morning sun. The landscape changed constantly. That was part of its appeal. Shepherds probably appreciated these places more than anyone. They spent countless hours watching sheep graze across open hillsides, following the slow rhythm of the animals rather than the ringing of church bells. Modern people might imagine such work becoming unbearably dull after a few hours. Medieval shepherds likely developed a different opinion. There is only so much excitement one can expect from a sheep. Eventually, your attention naturally drifts elsewhere. Many learn to notice the small details of the landscape. Clouds gathered over distant forests before rain arrived. Hawks circled high above, searching for prey. Rabbits darted between patches of long grass, while skylarks filled the air with songs almost too high to locate. Even the changing direction of the wind told experienced shepherds when weather might soon change. For farmers, climbing a hill often meant checking their land from above. From a higher viewpoint, they could see ripening grain, grazing livestock, neighbouring villages, winding rivers, and distant church towers rising above the trees. Looking across the countryside offered reassurance. The fields still stood. the cattle remained where they belonged. Another day's work had quietly reached its end. Travellers experienced similar moments. After hours spent walking narrow woodland paths or muddy roads, reaching an open hillside brought welcome relief. Pilgrims often paused to admire distant monasteries perched on ridges or castles, standing proudly above river valleys. They removed heavy packs, shared bread and cheese with companions, and simply enjoyed the silence before continuing their journey. These resting places gradually became familiar landmarks. Some hills even earned reputations as places for reflection. Local villagers climbed them during religious feast days, after difficult harvests, or whenever they wished to escape the noise below. There was something comforting about watching sunlight move slowly across the countryside, while realizing that life continued at its own patient pace. The wide horizon also reminded medieval people how vast the world truly was. Beyond the nearest village lay another. Beyond that stood forests, rivers, mountains, kingdoms and seas they would never see. Such thoughts could inspire both humility and hope. Personal troubles seemed a little smaller when viewed against an endless landscape stretching toward the horizon. As evening approached, these hills became especially beautiful. The setting sun bathed fields in warm golden light, while long shadows stretched across the meadows. Birds returned to their nests, the day's heat faded, and cool breezes carried the scent of fresh grass through the air. It was the sort of peaceful scene that required no monastery, no physician, and no elaborate remedy. Just a quiet place, an open sky, and enough time to watch another day gently come to its close. If wide meadows offered peace through stillness, the medieval pilgrimage offered peace through movement. Sometimes the best way to quiet an anxious mind was simply to keep walking. Every year, thousands of medieval men and women left behind their homes to travel toward famous holy places. Some journeyed to Canterbury, others to Santiago de Compostela, Rome, or countless local shrines scattered across Europe. They travelled for many reasons. Some hoped for miraculous healing. Others wished to fulfill a religious promise, seek forgiveness, or give thanks after surviving illness or war. Yet somewhere along the road, many discovered something they had never expected. The journey itself became part of the healing. Pilgrimage was rarely comfortable. Roads were uneven, boots wore thin, rain soaked clothing without warning, and nights were often spent in crowded inns, monasteries, or beneath simple shelters. Travellers carried little more than bread, cheese, dried meat, a water flask, and perhaps a walking staff polished smooth by constant use. It was hardly a luxury vacation. But perhaps that was precisely why it worked. For weeks or even months, pilgrims lived by a slower rhythm than ordinary life allowed. Instead of worrying about tomorrow's harvest or this year's taxes, their attention shifted towards simpler concerns: finding clean water, reaching the next village before sunset, repairing worn sandals, sharing a meal with fellow travellers. Life became wonderfully uncomplicated. The countryside accompanied them every step of the way. One morning they crossed mist-covered valleys, where dew sparkled across fields like tiny jewels. By afternoon, they followed rivers that wound lazily through forests alive with birdsong. Some days led over gentle hills covered in grazing sheep, while others disappeared beneath towering beeches whose branches formed cool green tunnels overhead. Each landscape offered something different. Pilgrims quickly learned to appreciate small moments that busy daily life often overlooked. A clear spring bubbling from a rocky hillside, wild strawberries growing beside the path, the comforting shade of an ancient oak after walking beneath the summer sun, the distant ringing of monastery bells drifting across an open valley long before the buildings themselves came into view. Nature quietly marked the passing of each day. Many medieval pilgrimage journals describe long stretches of silence between companions. Modern readers sometimes imagine this meant boredom or loneliness. More often, it reflected contentment. There was no need to fill every mile with conversation when the landscape already occupied the mind. Walking itself seemed to encourage reflection. With every steady step, yesterday's worries gradually lost their urgency. Arguments left behind at home seemed less important after several days on the road. Grief softened beneath endless horizons. Even fear became easier to carry when shared with fellow pilgrims walking beside you through forests, across bridges, and over mountain passes. The journey created unexpected friendships as well. Farmers walked beside merchants. Nobles shared fires with craftsmen. Young travellers listened to stories told by elderly pilgrims who had crossed the same roads decades earlier. Around evening campfires, strangers exchanged bread, advice, and tales of distant places. For a little while, social differences mattered less than reaching tomorrow's destination together. One suspects sore feet also encouraged humility. By the time pilgrims finally arrived at their shrine, many found that the greatest change had not occurred at the destination, but somewhere along the road itself. Weeks spent surrounded by rivers, forests, hills, and open skies had quietly restored something difficult to describe. Sometimes healing came through prayer. Sometimes it came through nature. And quite often, medieval people believed the two were impossible to separate. If pilgrims found comfort by moving through nature, most medieval people discovered peace by simply watching nature change. The passing of the seasons reminded them that nothing, whether joyful or difficult, lasted forever. For many people today, the idea of birth control feels like a modern invention. Yet if you stepped into Tudor England, you would quickly discover that men and women were asking remarkably familiar questions. How many children could a family realistically support? Could another pregnancy endanger a mother's life? Was there any way to delay having another baby without angering God or attracting unwanted attention? The answers they found were often strange, sometimes dangerous, and frequently ineffective. But the desire behind them was entirely human. Life during the Tudor period, which stretched from the reign of Henry VII to Elizabeth I, revolved around family. Marriage was expected, children were welcomed, and a large household often meant more helping hands in the fields, workshops, or family business. On paper, having many children sounded like a blessing. Reality was considerably less simple. Pregnancy carried enormous risks. Without modern hospitals, antibiotics, or an understanding of infection, every childbirth became a gamble. Mothers faced severe bleeding, obstructed labour, fever, and countless complications that physicians barely understood. Even experienced midwives knew that despite all their knowledge, some births simply ended in tragedy. For women, surviving childbirth was never guaranteed, nor was the baby. Infant mortality remained heartbreakingly common. Many children died before reaching their 5th birthday, while diseases that modern medicine treats with little concern could sweep through entire villages. Families often had many children partly because they knew, from painful experience, that not all would survive into adulthood. Even so, another pregnancy arriving too soon could place enormous strain on both mother and household. Food was rarely abundant. A poor harvest, a harsh winter, or an outbreak of disease could leave families struggling to survive. Every additional child meant another mouth to feed, another bed to build, another pair of shoes to somehow afford. Wealthier families worried less about bread, but often obsessed over inheritance. Producing the right heir at the right time became a matter of politics as much as family life. One only has to look at Henry VIII's famous desperation for a surviving son to appreciate how closely pregnancy could shape the future of an entire kingdom. Yet despite these concerns, discussing contraception openly remained unusual. Officially, the Church encouraged marriage, fertility, and openness to children. Most religious authorities viewed attempts to prevent conception with suspicion or outright condemnation. Medical books also spoke cautiously about the subject, often hiding advice within discussions of women's health or ancient medicine, rather than presenting it as straightforward guidance. That did not mean people stopped asking questions. Instead, those questions moved into kitchens, herb gardens, birthing chambers, and whispered conversations between mothers, daughters, sisters, and trusted midwives. Knowledge spread quietly, passed from one generation to the next without attracting too much attention. Some remedies came from respected Greek and Roman medical texts. Others emerged from local folklore. A few had surprising scientific foundations, while many relied more on hope than biology. In the chapters ahead, we'll explore these curious remedies one by one, separating documented Tudor practices from centuries of exaggeration and myth. Some may sound surprisingly sensible. Others will leave you wondering how anyone believed they could possibly work. And a few are so dangerous that the greatest mystery is how anyone survived trying them in the first place. If whispered conversations kept this knowledge alive, the herb garden became its quiet laboratory. To a Tudor family, a garden was far more than a place to grow vegetables. It served as a pharmacy, pantry, and first aid cabinet all at once. Long before pharmacies lined busy streets, households relied on carefully cultivated herbs to treat everything from headaches and stomach aches to fevers and infected wounds. Hidden among these useful plants were a handful that people believed could also influence fertility. Some of those beliefs stretch back more than 1,000 years. The Tudors inherited much of their medical knowledge from ancient Greek and Roman writers, particularly physicians like Hippocrates, Dioscorides, and Galen. Their books continued to circulate throughout Europe, copied by monks and later printed for educated readers. By the 16th century, many English herbalists still repeated remedies that had first been written during the Roman Empire. One herb appeared again and again: pennyroyal. With its small purple flowers and refreshing mint-like scent, pennyroyal hardly looked threatening. It grew easily in damp places and belonged to the mint family, making it seem perfectly harmless. Tudor herbal guides recommended it for a surprising number of ailments. It was used to ease digestive complaints, encourage sweating during fevers, and treat various women's disorders. Among those quiet descriptions lay a more controversial reputation. For centuries, pennyroyal had been associated with stimulating menstruation. Physicians believed that if a woman's monthly cycle had stopped unexpectedly, certain herbs might encourage it to return. Modern historians must be careful here, because the language used in Tudor texts often avoided directly mentioning pregnancy. Writers frequently referred to bringing down the courses, leaving readers to interpret exactly what they meant. In some cases, the implication was clear. Today we know that pennyroyal contains compounds capable of causing severe poisoning. Consuming concentrated amounts can damage the liver, kidneys, and nervous system, sometimes with fatal consequences. Modern medicine strongly warns against its use for any purpose related to pregnancy. The Tudor physicians, however, had no way of understanding the chemistry involved. They observed only that the herbs sometimes produced dramatic physical effects. Another commonly mentioned plant was rue. Its bluish-green leaves and strong aroma made it popular in monastery gardens, where it was valued for digestive problems and believed to ward off disease. Like pennyroyal, rue developed a reputation for influencing menstruation and fertility, yet it too carried serious risks. In large quantities it could cause violent illness, internal damage, and dangerous complications that physicians of the period often misunderstood. Then there was savin juniper. Unlike ordinary culinary herbs, savin was treated with far greater caution. Even Tudor medical writers occasionally acknowledged that it possessed extraordinary strength. It appeared in remedies intended to affect pregnancy, but they often advised careful handling, perhaps recognizing from experience that patients sometimes became gravely ill after taking it. Experience, rather than science, shaped these warnings. If enough people suffered after using a particular herb, wise healers remembered. What makes these plants fascinating is that they reveal an important truth about Tudor medicine. People were not simply inventing random remedies. They observed patterns, borrowed knowledge from respected authorities, and experimented within the limits of what they understood. Unfortunately, observation without modern biology could only take them so far. Sometimes the remedy appeared to work. Sometimes it did nothing at all. And sometimes the cure proved far more dangerous than the problem it was meant to solve. If herbs represented Tudor medicine's attempt to influence the body from within, some people looked for a far more direct solution. Rather than swallowing dangerous plants, they wondered whether conception itself could somehow be prevented before it ever began. The idea may sound surprisingly modern. In fact, barrier methods have existed in one form or another for thousands of years. By the time the Tudors ruled England, medical writers had inherited centuries of advice from ancient Greece, Rome, and the medieval Islamic world. Not every recommendation was widely practiced, and not every remedy can be proven to have been common in Tudor homes. But several appear often enough in surviving medical texts to show that people were genuinely thinking about physical ways to reduce the likelihood of pregnancy. One of the most frequently mentioned objects was the humble sponge. Sea sponges had long been valued throughout Europe for bathing and cleaning, but some ancient medical writers also suggested using small natural sponges inside the body before intercourse. They were sometimes soaked in substances such as vinegar, olive oil, or herbal mixtures before being inserted. The theory seemed sensible to physicians of the time. Some believed the sponge acted as a physical barrier. Others thought acidic liquids like vinegar somehow destroyed the seed responsible for conception. Neither explanation reflected an understanding of human reproduction as we know it today, but it represented an honest attempt to apply observation rather than magic. Modern medicine paints a more cautious picture. While a sponge can function as a physical barrier under certain conditions, the Tudor versions were neither sterile nor carefully designed. Reused natural sponges could easily carry bacteria, causing infections that physicians had no ability to treat. Vinegar, meanwhile, is not a reliable contraceptive, despite its long historical reputation. Another recommendation involved soft wool or linen. Some medical texts describe small pieces of clean wool being placed inside the body, occasionally coated with oils or herbal preparations. Again, the goal was simple: create an obstacle that might prevent conception. Whether ordinary Tudor couples actually followed this advice regularly is impossible to know. Surviving evidence comes largely from medical books written by educated physicians, not from the private lives of village families. As historians, it is important to distinguish between what was prescribed and what was practiced. Books often contain ideal advice rather than everyday reality. There are also scattered references to mixtures of honey, tree resins, or plant oils being applied alongside these barriers. Honey, interestingly, possesses natural antibacterial properties, though Tudor healers had no understanding of microbes. They valued it because wounds treated with honey often healed better than expected. That practical experience sometimes led physicians to include it in reproductive remedies as well, although there is little evidence that it reliably prevented pregnancy. Even wealthier women with access to court physicians faced the same uncertainty. No Tudor doctor could guarantee success. Every method relied upon trial, tradition, and hope far more than scientific proof. Perhaps the most striking thing about these early barrier methods is how familiar the underlying idea feels. The materials were crude, the medical explanations incomplete, and the effectiveness questionable, but the reasoning was surprisingly logical. People recognized that if conception could somehow be interrupted physically, pregnancy might be avoided. They were asking the right question. They simply lacked the scientific knowledge to arrive at the right answer. That gap between careful observation and true understanding would shape nearly every strange remedy the Tudors experimented with, as their search for reliable family planning continued through recipes that grew even more unusual. If herbs and homemade barriers failed to inspire confidence, some Tudor remedies became even stranger. Rather than relying on a single plant, people began combining ingredients into elaborate potions, powders, and recipes that promised to prevent pregnancy. Some came from respected medical books, others circulated through local folklore, passed quietly from neighbour to neighbour. A few sounded almost scientific for their time. Many sounded like someone had emptied half the kitchen into a bowl and hoped for the best. One common feature united nearly all of these recipes. They attempted to change the body's internal balance. Tudor medicine was built upon the ancient theory of the four humours. Physicians believed health depended on maintaining the proper balance between blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Every food, herb, and drink was thought to possess qualities such as hot, cold, dry, or moist. Pregnancy itself was often explained through these same principles. If conception resulted from one balance, perhaps another balance could prevent it. This idea inspired countless unusual mixtures. Certain recipes instructed women to drink infusions made from herbs mixed with wine or ale. Others recommended grinding seeds into fine powders before stirring them into everyday meals. Fennel, parsley, wild carrot seeds, and various bitter plants appeared in different combinations throughout Tudor manuscripts. Some ingredients had genuinely been used since classical antiquity, while others reflected local traditions unique to England. Wild carrot seeds deserve special mention. Modern researchers have discovered limited evidence that wild carrot, sometimes called Queen Anne's lace, may possess compounds capable of interfering with implantation under very specific circumstances. The evidence remains incomplete, and it certainly should not be considered a reliable contraceptive today. Still, it is fascinating that one of the plants Tudor healers experimented with continues to attract scientific interest centuries later. Unfortunately, that was the exception rather than the rule. Many recipes contained ingredients whose purpose is almost impossible to explain. Powders made from unusual minerals appeared alongside herbs. Animal fats were occasionally mixed into medicinal preparations. Eggs, vinegar, honey, and wine served as common bases simply because they were readily available in nearly every household. Sometimes physicians admitted they did not fully understand why a remedy worked. They only knew that respected authorities had recommended it generations earlier. Medical knowledge in Tudor England depended heavily on tradition. If an ancient Roman physician described a particular mixture, later writers often copied it with surprisingly little criticism. A recipe could survive for centuries simply because every generation assumed the previous one must have known something valuable. It was less like conducting experiments and more like carefully preserving inherited wisdom. Some remedies crossed the line into outright superstition. Charms were occasionally spoken while preparing medicines. Certain potions had to be consumed on particular days of the lunar cycle or before sunrise. Although educated physicians often dismissed such practices, ordinary people frequently blended medicine and folklore without seeing any contradiction between them. To a Tudor villager, both belonged to the same world. Looking back, it is tempting to laugh at some of these extraordinary recipes. Yet, doing so misses an important point. These people were trying to solve one of humanity's oldest problems with the tools available to them. Without microscopes, hormones, or an understanding of reproduction, they relied on observation, inherited knowledge, and hope. Sometimes hope came bottled in a carefully prepared herbal drink. Sometimes it came in a recipe so peculiar that even a modern cookbook would politely decline to include it. Either way, these curious mixtures revealed just how determined Tudor men and women were to find some measure of control over lives that often felt governed by chance. If strange recipes filled the pages of Tudor medical books, the most valuable knowledge often never appeared in writing at all. It lived in conversations, in kitchens warmed by the fire, in birthing rooms where only women were present, during long afternoons spent preparing herbs together, and in the quiet advice passed from an experienced midwife to a nervous young bride before her first child. For most Tudor women, these private conversations were far more important than anything a university-trained physician might write in Latin. Medicine during the 16th century was divided by both education and gender. Learned doctors, almost all men, studied ancient texts at universities and served wealthy households whenever possible. Midwives, by contrast, built their knowledge through years of experience. They attended dozens, sometimes hundreds of births, cared for mothers afterward, and became trusted figures within their communities. Their classrooms were real life. Every difficult delivery, every healthy recovery, and every heartbreaking loss became another lesson. Because of this experience, midwives often understood women's bodies in practical ways that many physicians did not. They recognized the signs of pregnancy long before modern tests existed. They could estimate when labor might begin. They knew which mothers needed extra rest after childbirth and which herbs helped ease pain or reduce fever. Naturally, women also asked them another question. How could the next pregnancy be delayed? This is where history becomes especially interesting. Very few Tudor midwives left behind written records of these conversations. Much of what we know comes from legal documents, church investigations, medical manuals, and occasional references made by physicians. Historians must therefore be careful not to assume that every remedy described in a book reflected everyday practice. Still, the evidence strongly suggests that reproductive knowledge circulated through female networks. A newly married woman rarely faced these questions alone. Mothers advised daughters, older sisters guided younger ones, friends exchanged ideas while washing clothes beside rivers or baking bread together. Widows who had raised large families often became respected sources of practical advice. The information was rarely presented as formal medicine. Instead, it sounded more like common household wisdom. Try this herb. Wait until your monthly courses return. Breastfeed the baby as long as possible. Rest before trying for another child. Some of this advice proved surprisingly sensible. Modern medicine recognizes that exclusive breastfeeding can naturally reduce fertility for a period after childbirth, although it is far from completely reliable. Tudor women certainly noticed that mothers who nursed infants for many months often conceived less quickly than those who stopped early. They could not explain the hormones involved, but careful observation had revealed a genuine pattern. Not every piece of advice was equally accurate. Some recommendations relied entirely on folklore. Others confused coincidence with cause and effect. If one woman drank a certain herbal tea and did not become pregnant immediately, neighbours might credit the tea rather than simple chance. Stories spread quickly. Evidence spread much more slowly. Midwives occupied a delicate position within Tudor society. They were respected, needed, and often deeply trusted, yet they also worked under the watchful eye of both church and local authorities. Officially, their duty was to protect mothers and babies, not encourage the prevention of pregnancy. As a result, any conversations about fertility were usually conducted with discretion. Quiet voices were safer than public ones. Looking back, perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these women's secret knowledge is not that every remedy worked. Most did not. Rather, it is that generation after generation continued sharing what they had learned, refining observations through experience and compassion. Long before medicine fully understood reproduction, Tudor women were building their own informal network of knowledge, one whispered conversation at a time. If midwives shared their knowledge in whispers, there was a good reason for their discretion. In Tudor England, conversations about preventing pregnancy were not simply medical matters, they were moral ones. The 16th century was a deeply religious age. Whether under Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary I, or Elizabeth I, daily life remained shaped by Christian beliefs. Even as England experienced dramatic religious upheaval, churches dominated village skylines, feast days structured the calendar, and sermons reminded people that marriage and children formed part of God's natural order. On the surface, the message seemed straightforward. Marriage existed partly to create families. Children were viewed as blessings, and the Bible's command to be fruitful and multiply was quoted often enough that few people misunderstood the official position. Intentionally preventing conception was generally viewed with suspicion by religious authorities, especially if it involved deception, magical practices, or deliberate attempts to interfere with what was believed to be divine providence. That was the ideal. Daily life, however, rarely matched ideals perfectly. A village priest might preach about welcoming every child, but the congregation listening to him knew exactly how difficult another pregnancy could be. They had seen women die in childbirth. They had watched infants fail to survive their first winter. They understood what happened when a poor harvest coincided with another growing family. Faith did not erase practical concerns. Instead, people quietly learned to live with both. This balancing act appeared throughout Tudor society. Couples generally did not speak openly about limiting pregnancies, yet many likely hoped to space their children naturally whenever possible. Long periods of breastfeeding, temporary separation caused by seasonal work, illness, or military service, and the simple unpredictability of fertility all influenced family size without requiring anyone to challenge religious teaching directly. Nature often accomplished what medicine could not. Historians are careful not to exaggerate the evidence. There are very few surviving letters in which ordinary Tudor husbands and wives openly discuss trying to avoid pregnancy. Privacy itself leaves little documentary trail. Yet demographic records reveal that many families experienced significant gaps between children, suggesting that biology, circumstance, and perhaps conscious choices all played a role. Not every interval was accidental. Economic realities made those intervals valuable. Among poorer families, another child could mean stretching already limited food supplies through another difficult winter. Craftsmen worried about apprenticeships and inheritance. Farmers calculated whether their land could support another generation. Wealthier households faced different pressures. Producing heirs remained essential, but pregnancies also affected politics, property, and carefully arranged marriages. Everyone faced decisions. Only the details differed. The English Reformation added another layer of uncertainty. As monarchs changed the country's official religion several times during the Tudor period, teachings on many subjects shifted in tone and emphasis. Yet, despite fierce debates over doctrine, attitudes toward marriage and childbearing remained broadly consistent. Family life continued to be regarded as both a social duty and a religious responsibility. That left little room for public discussion of contraception. Private discussion, however, never disappeared. It simply remained behind closed doors. Perhaps this is what makes Tudor family life so fascinating. Official records often present a world of certainty, where everyone followed the same moral expectations. Real life was far more complicated. Ordinary people constantly balanced faith with survival, religious ideals with physical dangers, and public respectability with private worries. They prayed for healthy children. They mourned those they lost. And in the quiet spaces between sermons and everyday life, many continued searching for safe ways to protect the women whose lives were placed at risk each time another pregnancy began. Their methods were often imperfect. Their motivations were profoundly human. If ordinary families worried about feeding another child, noble families faced an entirely different problem: